From ancient times, people understood the importance of knowing the history of their nation and preserving it for posterity. It is history that helps a person to realize his belonging to a particular nation and culture. However, throughout the centuries, history had yet another task. In any state, it stood guard over its political interests and, therefore, was largely subjective. Today, as a result of new scientific research, it has become evident that the entire world history is monstrously and largely consciously and deliberately distorted. Most of us are convinced that falsifying history on a global scale is impossible because such a global falsification is similar to a special operation that cannot be carried out imperceptibly and in concert in all countries at once. And who could do it? A modern person, brought up on the now generally accepted historical version of Scaliger Petavius, will inevitably ask, how could it happen that the true history was forgotten, and a fictional history took its place in books and textbooks? Is it possible to change the history of all mankind? It turns out that it is, and we will tell you about it in our film. In the previous film of our documentary series, we talked about the fact that there was only one world power in the world, the Russia Horde Empire. This was in the 13th–16th centuries of the Common Era. There was no ancient Italian Rome or ancient Greece, so vividly described in history books, supposedly before the beginning of the Common Era. Before the beginning of the Common Era, there was no China with its supposedly millennia-old antiquity, nor India or the Sumerian kingdom. There was no ancient Egypt or the states of Maya and Aztecs. All of these supposedly very ancient civilizations did exist, but only emerged in the Middle Ages, starting from the 13th–14th centuries. And the rulers of all European lands were not independent, because they were only sovereigns vicegerents of the Russian Tsar Emperor. At the turn of the 16th–17th centuries, a rift in political power in Moscow and a change in the ruling dynasty took place in Russia. These events, which later became known as the Time of Troubles, were one of the main reasons for separatism in Western Europe. Today, this period of history is known as the Reformation. In textbooks, it is only described as a religious split, schism. But the main aspect is omitted in the description of the Reformation. It was during this time that European rulers, that is, the horde governors, found themselves without a master, without an emperor. Therefore, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the rapid separation of the Western provinces from the empire and the formation of new independent European states began, which required a new history. After the victory of the Reformation, the royal governors, who became the rulers of independent states, many of which had not yet fully formed, had to solve two main problems. The first was to justify their right to power, thus giving it some legal appearance and legitimacy. The second problem was to consolidate their power as supreme, to destroy the memory of the past in order to make it impossible to return to this common past. Their victory was not easy. Many European nations for a long time did not recognize the rule of the reformers and continued to fight for the restoration of the former empire. The formation of new states in Europe mainly occurred in the 17th–18th centuries in bloody battles and wars. To establish themselves as new independent rulers for the former imperial governors was a matter of life and death. But as long as people remembered the great empire, the position of the reformers was extremely precarious. The main task that united all the newly proclaimed rulers of Europe, including the Romanovs, the new royal dynasty in Russia, was to destroy this memory, to forever erase the facts of the true past from the pages of history. Not only were the direct participants of those events involved in this global conspiracy, but also their descendants, who still guard the secret of the criminal actions of their ancestors.
After the collapse of the empire, the former governors seized power and immediately began rewriting history, presenting it in a favorable light for themselves. Specifically, they needed to appear as independent and hereditary sovereigns in the eyes of their subjects, who were descendants of independent rulers who had once ruled these lands. Otherwise, they could not have created their own states, because according to the laws of the empire, they were illegal rebellious rulers. It was a matter of life and death for them to break free from this label. Therefore, when they were composing history, they naturally took the history that existed as a model. This was the history of the Great Russia Horde medieval empire. Therefore, the source for writing history for all of them was the same. They simply changed the clothing, names, and dates, sent various events into the past, created phantoms, but the informational basis for all of this activity was one. This was the history of the Great Russian medieval empire. That is why, using our methods, we find that the history of various European states traces back to the same source.
The imagination of the reformers was absolutely unrestricted. In order to give significance to their newly emerged countries, and also to their ancestors, they extended their history by hundreds and even thousands of years. Phantom reflections of the dynasty of the Horde rulers' emperors, pushed far back into the distant past, were declared exclusively their own, local ones. They attributed glorious military victories to their ancestors and not only defeats, but also all known human vices to their enemies. In this new history, new epics, kingdoms, and legendary personalities appeared which were actually just phantom reflections of reality, but from a much later period, from the 11th–17th centuries. These phantoms, duplicates, took the place of the genuine history, the history of the Great Russian Empire, but under different names.
Thus, Europe's victory over Russia, over the former metropolis of the great Mongol Empire, was cemented by creating a new false version of history. With the help of this version, the new rulers managed to form a new self-consciousness among the peoples of Europe, Asia, and America. In 1 or 2 generations, memories of genuine history were gone, disappeared from the memory of peoples. And over time, the people believed in their new identity.
The invented history often contradicted the authentic character and traditional culture of a particular people. Sometimes these contradictions led to tragic consequences. Italy is a vivid example of this. In the 20th century, admirers of the invented ancient Italian history composed by the reformers attempted to revive the spirit of the Roman Empire in Italy. A beautiful but fabricated myth collided with harsh reality. The same thing happened with Germany, which tried to revive the alleged 1,000-year Reich. What happened next is well known. With the help of distorted history, the reformers were able to achieve a very important effect for the falsifiers: to create a sense of loss and absence of a national idea in the Russian society of the 17th-18th centuries. Not only the past but also the future was stolen from the Russian people. Deprived of its authentic history, Russia repeatedly found itself in historical and political deadlocks. To maintain their power in a destroyed empire, the principle of divide and conquer was used. The unified state, the empire, was fragmented. Hostility and first of all, religious hostility arose between its separate parts, which was fueled by some rulers. It was only after the destruction of the United Russia Horde Empire on the Eurasian territory that the religious wars began. The once united Christianity split into several branches: Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism. We will detail the history of the division of churches in one of our upcoming films. The emergence of at least 5 independent religions sparked a dispute over which religion was more correct. One argument for the correctness of faith was its antiquity. The older, the better. Thus, another reason arose for writing a new version of history. The authority of each religion largely depended on the international influence of the states that practiced it. Undoubtedly, the stronger the country, the more authoritative its religion, the less it needed artificial elongation of its history. Conversely, if the state was weak in military and political relations, it composed a very ancient history for itself and its religion, replacing the authority of power with the authority of age. In other words, younger religions and states lengthened their history to the maximum extent, while older ones elongated their history less. To this day, many countries try to use the argument of their supposed antiquity when resolving both religious and territorial disputes.
Another way to divide the peoples who lived in a unified empire was to create new languages. In the 15th-16th centuries, throughout the vast Great Russian medieval empire, the Church Slavonic language was used as the state language and in Europe as well. After the rebellion of the Reformation, in order to create new independent of each other states, new rulers had to introduce a new language to each of them. There was no large number of languages, and they were created artificially. Thus, French, English, German, and other new languages emerged. Because in the Middle Ages, they had other languages, Polish, and so on. Even ancient Greek and ancient Latin were also invented by reformers and quite late. And even later, Serbian and Bulgarian languages appeared where at the beginning of the 19th century Russian was still spoken.
Building religious and language barriers allowed new rulers to destroy the unity of the peoples of the former empire. Encountering these barriers, the unified cultural space began to break down, and age-old ties between people began to fray. Over time, all the peoples of the dissolved empire came to believe that they had always spoken, prayed, and lived differently, and that they were all very different. Thus, the 3 main tools of falsification were the division of the unified Christian religion into 5 main branches: writing new history for entire states and peoples, and creating new languages for communication. The falsification of world history was not random. It can be said that it was largely thought out and coordinated. All of this activity was actually a pan-European state program, which explains the significant coordination of actions of historians from different countries of Western Europe and historians of the Romanov era. This is also indicated by the history of supposedly ancient printed publications. It is noteworthy that from the very beginning, these publications were not disjointed and random, which looks rather strange. In the natural course of events, in one place someone would print one book, in another place another publisher independently would print another book, and so on. Only later, over time, people would begin to collect individual printed books, and on their basis produce fundamental multi-volume collections.
On the contrary, if ancient history is intentionally falsified, then the picture is likely to be reversed. That is, large voluminous fundamental collections of old books and writings would be written and published first. Moreover, they wouldn't be created chaotically, but in one or several centers. It is more convenient and easier to control the process of falsification that way. Then, based on these so-called approved textbooks, scattered essays would be written, which would be based on the created false set of supposedly primary sources. It is this picture that we see in the 17th to 18th centuries. As we understand it, in fact, we see a picture of the falsification of ancient history, its primary sources.
Thus, the Flemish order of the Jesuits specialized in forged biographies of saints. From 1643 to 1794, it published 53 volumes. For the 17th and 18th centuries, this was a lot. The monopolistic historical activity of the Flemish order was interrupted by the French Revolution. Another center of production of falsifications was the Benedictine order, which worked on the writings of the Church Fathers. It is well known that the monks not only copied ancient manuscripts, but also edited them. For example, while preparing an ancient manuscript for printing, the Benedictines compared all ancient biblical quotes with the 17th century Bible text. And all fragments that differed from the late text were brought into line, or simply put, rewritten. So today we are forced to read not authentic ancient texts, but the result of the work of Benedictine monks. And this is a best-case scenario, because the text may even turn out to be a forgery from the 17th-18th centuries. In the mid-19th century, the French abbot Jacques-Paul Min republished the works of the Benedictines. This multi-volume edition was called the Patrology, and consisted of 221 volumes of Latin writers and 161 volumes of Greek writers. The sheer number of volumes published by Min eloquently speaks of the scope of the Benedictine order's activities in correcting ancient manuscripts. It is therefore not surprising that we encounter the results of forgers' work everywhere. As we can see, several departments were involved in the composition of the correct history. In the most responsible cases, the leaders of the historical project themselves took charge. For example, it is likely that what is known as Chronicle by Eusebius of Caesarea, also known as Eusebius Pamphilus, was personally written by Joseph Scaliger, the original of which was allegedly lost. However, historians today say that Scaliger began to restore the Chronicle, but did not complete his work, and in 1787 it was found in an Armenian translation. Suspicion of forgery is reinforced by the very appearance of the Chronicle. Eusebius Pamphilus' chronological tables look exactly the same as the tables published by the Scaliger school in the 17th and 18th centuries. That is, pages are decorated with multiple vertical columns, each dedicated to the chronology of a particular country or specific flow of events. This Scaliger's forgery is not harmless at all, as he had far-reaching goals, since about 3/4 of the dates that historians still operate to this day are taken from Eusebius' Chronicle. That is, they unfoundedly rely on Scaliger's 17th century datings without any real justification. As is known, medieval texts were written in a rather clumsy language, and it is not surprising that only over time does the primitive colloquial language become highly literary. Moreover, in the past, when composing a text, only the core words were written, which were made up of consonants. Vowels were either omitted or replaced with small superscript symbols, which is why the well-known problem of restoring pronunciation of many ancient texts, including biblical ones, arose. People did not always know how to correctly insert the necessary vowels to restore the text of a document. Why were texts written without vowels in ancient times? The fact is that the material for writing was very expensive, and scribes had to save it. Therefore, they shortened the text by leaving only consonants. Naturally, with a lack of writing material, it was not possible to talk about the formation of a highly artistic literary language. But when people learned to make paper, which became cheaper over time, they had the opportunity to develop a good language. It is not surprising that for many peoples in the Middle Ages, literary language was just being formed. Surprisingly, the earlier purported ancient texts were written in beautiful style. For example, let us open the work of the supposedly ancient historian Titus Livy. Here is how he colorfully and eloquently leads his narrative.
Whether the task I have undertaken of writing a complete history of the Roman people from the very commencement of its existence will reward me for the labor spent on it, I neither know for certain, nor if I did know would I venture to say, for I see that this is an old established and a common practice, each fresh writer being invariably persuaded that he will either attain greater certainty in the materials of his narrative, or surpass the rudeness of antiquity in the excellence of his style.
Historians assert that Titus Livy wrote 144 books in the supposedly 1st century BC in such an elegant style. To develop such a confident and sophisticated style, he must have practiced and therefore written quite a few drafts. However, there was no paper in antiquity. Historians claim that the ancient classics wrote exclusively on parchment. But let's see how accessible it was. To make one sheet of parchment, several complex operations had to be performed. First, skin a young calf or lamb, no older than 6 weeks. Soak the skin in running water for 6 days. Scrape off the flesh with a special scraper. Loosen the wool by putrefying the skin in a damp pit with lime ashing for 12 to 20 days. Remove the loosened wool. To remove excess lime from the skin, soak it in oat or wheat bran. To make the skin soft after drying, treat it with vegetable tanning extracts. Even out any roughness by rubbing the skin with pumice, previously sprinkled with chalk. Because of this laborious process, parchment was considered as precious as gems. And this situation persisted until the invention of rag paper in the 14th century. If we believe historians that the texts of Livy and other alleged ancient authors were written 1.5 to 2 millennia before the advent of paper, then how many calves and lambs were needed to make the parchment on which ancient writers practiced their skills? It is more logical to assume that entire herds of animals were not exterminated for the sake of literary creativity. Most likely, all these ancient books were written in the Middle Ages when paper was already widely available. Quite a few works of ostensible ancient philosophers, historians, and mathematicians have survived to the present day. However, for some reason, all of these works were discovered only in the Renaissance. Historians do not provide a logical explanation for why this happened precisely in the 15th–16th centuries. In addition, there is not a single line of the author's original manuscript of these works in any museum or library in the world. There are only translations or copies, sometimes double or triple, always from a supposedly lost original. Well-known researchers of ancient texts independently have come to the conclusion that some famous texts were written not at the turn of the Common Era, but much later. A typical example is the works of Cornelius Tacitus. It is believed that the ancient Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, author of numerous books including the famous Histories, lived in the 1st century AD. The main copies of Tacitus's Histories, known as the 1st and 2nd Medicean manuscript, are kept in the public National Library in Florence. According to the Scaligerian chronology, these copies are prototypes of all other ancient Tacitus's manuscript copies. The first printed edition of Tacitus's Histories was made in 1470 supposedly from the 2nd Medicean manuscript or from its copy, which was kept in Venice, in the library of St. Mark. But the manuscript mysteriously disappeared from there, and perhaps it was never there at all. The history of the discovery of this work is quite vague. It is believed that in 1425, the prominent humanist and writer of the 15th century, Poggio Bracciolini, received an inventory of a number of manuscripts from a monk at the Gersfeld Abbey, which included a manuscript of Tacitus's minor works. Poggio Bracciolini is considered one of the brightest authors of the 15th century, having authored many excellent historical and moralistic books. Bracciolini was a brilliant imitator, and to please the reader, he was able to write like Seneca, Petronius, or Titus Livius, among others. He was like a literary chameleon, and could imitate anyone. He wrote about theological questions in such a way that, if not for his signature, they would have been taken for the works of the Church Fathers. Bracciolini was so popular that a monument was erected in his honor in Florence, sculpted by none other than Donatello. It is known that Bracciolini liked to live in grand style and was always in need of money. He chose to earn additional income by producing and editing copies of the works of ancient authors. It's worth noting that in the 15th century, this was a very profitable business. With the help of Florentine publisher Niccolò Niccoli, Bracciolini set up a permanent business of processing ancient literature. He attracted a number of rather educated assistants, although with a very dubious reputation. Bracciolini made his first discoveries in the abandoned and damp tower of the St. Gallen monastery, where he supposedly had the good fortune to find a huge library of ancient manuscripts. There were works by Quintilian, Valerius Flaccus, Asconius Pedianus, Nonius Marcellus, and Probus. After some time, Bracciolini discovered fragments of the works of another ancient author, Calpurnius. However, the circumstances of this discovery are unknown. The manuscripts that Bracciolini passed off as originals, as well as the copies made from them, he sold for huge sums. For example, with the money he earned from selling a copy of Titus Livius's manuscript to Alfonso d'Aragona, he bought a villa in Florence. Bracciolini's clients included the Medici, Sforza, Este, aristocratic families in England, the Duchy of Burgundy, Cardinal Orsini, Colonna family, and wealthy people such as Bartolomeo di Bardio, as well as universities that were either acquiring libraries or expanding their book collections. In 1425, after receiving a catalogue of books from a monk that included works by Tacitus, Bracciolini immediately informed his business partner, the bookseller Niccoli, and offered to buy these ancient books. Niccoli agreed, but the deal somehow dragged on for several years. Throughout this entire time, Bracciolini delayed completing the transaction under various pretexts. When Niccoli grew tired of receiving letters with excuses from him, he demanded that Bracciolini send him the catalogue brought by the monk. And then it turned out that Tacitus's Histories was not in the catalogue. How was Bracciolini going to sell something that didn't exist?
At the end of the 19th century, the scholars Hokert and Ross were studying Tacitus's Histories. And they came to the conclusion that this Histories does not belong to the 1st century AD, as is believed, but to the 15th. And they accused Bracciolini himself, who found it, of writing this history. Hokert and Ross studied all the mentions of Tacitus before the 15th century, and they found that these mentions were too general and vague and could refer to either Tacitus or some other person. These mentions don't really say anything. Both Hokert and Ross directly asserted that Bracciolini wrote this history in the 15th century.
Despite the fact that Hokert and Ross conducted extensive research on Tacitus's Histories, and we should be grateful to them for this study, their main conclusion was incorrect. They accused Tacitus of falsification, but they worked within the framework of Scaligerian chronology, which was erroneous. They did not understand what they had actually discovered. According to our reconstruction and our results, it follows that in reality this text is not a forgery, not a falsification. It was written later by Bracciolini, under the pseudonym of Tacitus, and describes genuine events of the 12th–15th centuries.
Throughout history, forgers have created fakes not only for the sake of material gain. Some did it to satisfy their own vanity, while others did it even with seemingly good intentions. For example, the prominent figure of the Czech national revival, Václav Hanka, very much wanted to prove the antiquity and high level of culture of his native Czech people. To do this, he fabricated the Dvor Krolovi and Zelina Hora manuscripts, which contained ancient Czech legends and tales. If the fact of forgery had not been discovered by the Czech linguist Jan Gebauer, then today, perhaps, these manuscripts would have been considered genuine. It should be noted that Hanka's level of forgery was quite high. So today his creation is studied as a monument of Czech literature of the 19th century. Unfortunately, Václav Hanka did not stop with the creation of the Dvor Krolovi and Zelina Hora manuscripts. From 1823, he served as a librarian at the National Czech Museum in Prague. There was not a single manuscript left in the museum's library that Hanka did not put his hand to. He altered texts, inserted words, glued in sheets, and deleted paragraphs. Hanka invented an entire school of ancient artists, whose names he inserted into genuine antique manuscripts that came into his hands. The exposure of this incredible forgery on such a large scale was accompanied by a deafening scandal. In 1827, Prosper Mérimée released a collection of ballads titled The Gazla, under the guise of translations from Balkan languages. The book was a great success, and even Alexander Pushkin made a translation of the book into Russian. Pushkin turned out to be more gullible than, for example, Goethe, who immediately sensed the hoax. For the second edition of the songs, Mérimée wrote an ironic preface in which he listed those whom he had managed to fool.
I learned a few words of Slavonic, and wrote in a fortnight a collection of ballads. The collection was secretly printed in Strasbourg and was supplied with notes and a portrait of the author. The secret was carefully kept, and the success was enormous.
At the same time, these ballads had the greatest success not among ordinary readers, but among specialists who did not doubt their authenticity at all. In 1849, the Finnish epic Kalevala was published, which, as it turned out later, was written by a Finnish doctor and professor of the Finnish language of the 19th century, Elias Lönnrot. This literary work corresponded so well to the general mood of that time that it was immediately recognized as a national epic and played an important role in creating a sense of Finnish national identity and in shaping the Finnish nation.
The 17th and 18th centuries were rich in finds and the discovery of national epics. This was also the era of the creation of national states in Europe, according to our reconstruction. This fully corresponds to our reconstruction, because national epics were one of the important elements in the formation of the national identity of individual states, the new states of Europe.
At the same time, it was announced that certain recently discovered old epics were supposedly written a long time ago. Here are just a few examples. The German heroic epic poem, The Song of the Nibelungs, was supposedly written around the year 1200, but was first printed in 1757. The Spanish epic poem, The Song of My Cid, was supposedly created around the year 1140, but the first edition was published in 1779. The heroic epic of medieval France, The Song of Roland, is believed to have had its earliest version dating back to 1170, but in reality, it was first published in 1737. The English epic poem, Beowulf, was first published in Latin in 1845, and in English in 1849. Most likely, all the above-mentioned epics were written much later, in the 17th or 18th centuries, and are stylized literary works designed to appear ancient. The young, emerging nations were in great need of such literature. In order for a newly invented history to take the place of the former imperial history, it was not enough to just write new books and falsify ancient documents. First and foremost, all written sources that contradicted this fabrication had to be destroyed. A real terror was organized against the wrong books and wrong authors. Tens of thousands of books recognized as wrong were thrown into a fire of the Inquisition. There were many more such books than the works recognized as canonical. Beginning in 1559, the infamous Index of Forbidden Books was compiled in the Vatican. Not only were individual books condemned, but also the authors of these books. If at least one book by a writer was included in the index, then other works by the same author were subject to mandatory search and destruction. For example, in the book The Kingdom of the Slavs, by Mavro Orbini, there is a list of authors and primary sources he used. Today, most of these authors are unknown. Many of them are marked with the annotation, Dannato Autore, which means, condemned author. In addition to the main list of banned books, lists of cleansed or subject to cleansing books were compiled, which is to say, subject to partial correction. Special commissions had the right to censor any part of the text, prohibit publications, conduct searches in bookstores and printing houses, inspect bales of books at the border. Commissioners of the Holy Tribunal were stationed in all harbors, who allowed unloading only after verifying that there were no forbidden books on board. The Inquisition seized forbidden books not only from mere mortals, but also from people of status. In 1602 in Spain, the Inquisition raided the library of the Queen's personal spiritual advisor. The Spanish king begged humbly to leave him a few forbidden books. The Grand Inquisitor personally compiled a list of literary works that the king was allowed to read. The mass burning of books continued until the written memory of the great empire was destroyed. Today, there is no comprehensive atlas of all the ancient geographical maps that have survived to this day. Only individual maps or atlases are occasionally published in different countries. However, often these maps lack detailed enlargements of faded or erased details, which frequently contain very important information for researchers. The first geographical descriptions of countries and continents were not scientific maps in the modern sense of the word, but only brief lists. The next step in the development of cartography was the representation of maps in the form of a circle, divided into 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Within each sector, corresponding countries and peoples were listed. With the development of coastal navigation, that is, sailing along the coasts, maps with approximate outlines of countries appeared. And finally in the 15th–16th centuries, with the beginning of the Age of Exploration, did countries and seas on maps begin to acquire accurate outlines, and geographical descriptions became more detailed. Interestingly, on the geographical maps of the 15th–16th centuries, the same names of different territories, settlements, and rivers often appear. The reason is that the great empire, spreading its conquests, transferred Russian-Turkish geographical names to colonized lands. And this is not surprising. The conquerors came to undeveloped lands and called new places by names familiar to them, in memory of their distant homeland. But in the 17th–18th centuries, a new version of world history began to be created and implemented in Europe and Russia. The historians of the Scaligerine school began to erase the history of the great empire from the chronicles. Many imperial names either disappeared from geographical maps altogether or moved to other places. For example, the evangelical Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, described in the New Testament, or as we call it, the evangelical Jerusalem, was the capital of the Byzantine, or more precisely, the Tsargrad Empire, of the 11th–13th centuries. When the Scaligerine historians began to create an erroneous, incorrect version of history, they needed to distort the history of the Tsargrad kingdom. To do this, they claimed that Jerusalem, described in the Gospels, was allegedly located on the territory of modern-day Palestine.
Another example is the history of Veliki Novgorod. For more than 3 centuries, this city was not only the capital of Russia but also the capital of the entire great medieval Russian Empire, which included Europe and many other lands, almost all of Eurasia. Generally speaking, Yaroslavl was referred to as Veliki Novgorod, the city of Yaroslavl on the Volga, according to our reconstruction. However, in a more general sense, the entire Vladimir Suzdal Russia was also called Veliki Novgorod, the capital region of the great empire with its center in Yaroslavl, which included other cities that served as royal headquarters. Unlike Yaroslavl, where the administrative services of the empire were located, the royal headquarters, where the royal court was situated, were in different places such as Suzdal, in Vladimir for a very long time, in Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, and so on. All of this was Vladimir Suzdal Russia. However, later in the 17th and 18th centuries, when historians falsified Russian history, Veliki Novgorod was moved on paper from the banks of the Volga to the banks of the Volkhov in the northwest corner of Russia.
Thanks to such manipulations, many old names of Russian territories ended up in other countries and even on other continents. The name Mongolia was moved to the Gobi Desert. India began to be called a country on the Indostan Peninsula. The Chinese also received some Russian names. All of this geographical map manipulation was done exclusively on paper in the offices. Then, missionary reformers armed with new maps arrived in Africa or Asia and told the local inhabitants what their country was called in ancient times. Presumably, at first, the locals shrugged their shoulders in confusion, but over time, they agreed. And for those who found the stories of the missionaries unconvincing, the reformers always had fires and other persuasive means at hand. It is likely that the process of remaking geographical maps was completed only in the 19th century. A special place in the study of ancient geographical maps is occupied by the question of their dating. After all, many maps simply do not indicate the year of their creation. However, historians confidently assign them, for example, to the 14th or 15th centuries, or to the 16th century. But it is quite obvious that these maps now need to be redated. Numerous cases of forgery of written documents and alterations of geographical maps seriously call into question the correctness of their dating. Until 1991, many considered Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky's version of the existence and destruction of a world empire and the global falsification of world history to be interesting but unlikely. The scale of the conspiracy seemed too big, but after the collapse of the USSR, millions of people living in the post-Soviet space saw with their own eyes that after the collapse of the empire, falsification of history becomes inevitable. In order to divide the peoples who lived for centuries in one state, It is simply necessary to instill the idea of their independence and self-sufficiency. Those who still do not believe in the conspiracy against world history should simply open textbooks that are published in the former Soviet republics: Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. What is written in these textbooks goes against not only genuine historical facts, but also against common sense, and sometimes international laws. Unfortunately, a whole generation of young people has already been educated on these textbooks. And this is in our time, when any information can be transmitted almost instantly. It seems that nothing can be concealed, let alone falsified. But it turns out that everything depends not only on access to information, but also on its content and presentation. If human consciousness can be manipulated in the age of television, the internet, and mobile communications, what can we say about people who lived 300 to 400 years ago? And today, as in those distant years, new rulers of new states change religion, trying to detach it from its roots. For example, in Ukraine, they forcibly try to create their own patriarchate, separating the Orthodox Church from the Moscow Patriarchate. They strengthen other religions, primarily the Catholic one, create a new language, filling the former common Ukrainian with Polish words and abandoning the Russian language. They rewrite history, inventing new heroes and new myths. What is happening is exactly what happened in the years of the collapse of the Russian Horde World Empire in the 17th century. We have only told about a very small fraction of those historical fabrications that have been carried out over the past few centuries. In our upcoming films, we will repeatedly return to the topic of falsification of history and present new evidence for it. In the next film, we will talk about how teaching aids were created over the past 4 centuries for those who were supposed to believe in the history of Scaliger and Petavius.